In the bustling corridors of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, a quiet janitor was about to face the dismissal of her life. What started as routine restroom cleaning took a shocking turn when she came face to face with two men speaking in hushed, urgent Arabic about cleansing and gifts. Miriam Mimi Haddad wasn't your typical airport maintenance worker. For 15 years, she had spent her life as a military linguist in the Middle East, known for her ability to detect threats that others missed and prevent attacks before they claimed innocent lives. When she encountered the terrorist conspirators discussing explosive devices and precise timing, she had no idea she was walking into a battle against institutional prejudice as dangerous as any enemy she'd faced overseas. Mimi's desperate attempts to warn security officers who saw only a, quote, janitor with delusions would lead to a race against time that would test everything she'd learned about courage, persistence, and the deadly cost of assumptions. What began as another invisible day of mopping floors would become a masterclass in how true heroism often comes from the most unexpected sources. The Atlanta airport and the 200 passengers whose lives hung in the balance would never be the same after discovering that sometimes the most powerful weapon against terror is someone everyone thinks doesn't matter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the massive glass walls of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport as Miriam Mimi Haddad swiped her badge at the employee entrance. The familiar beep echoed in the corridor where maintenance workers, food service staff, and security personnel moved through their routines like well-rehearsed actors in an endless play. At 52, Mimi had perfected the art of invisibility. Her gray uniform blended seamlessly with the institutional walls, her quiet demeanor ensuring she passed through crowds like a whisper that no one quite remembered hearing. She collected her cart from the supply closet, checking the inventory with practiced efficiency. Disinfectant, paper towels, trash bags, floor cleaner, the tools of a trade that most passengers never noticed until something went wrong. The weight of the mop handle felt familiar in her hands, though those same hands had once gripped an M4 carbine during convoy operations outside Fallujah. That was another life, one she'd carefully folded away like an old uniform stored in the back of a closet. The terminal was already buzzing with the controlled chaos of early afternoon travel. Business executives rushed past with rolling luggage and urgent phone calls, families herded children toward departure gates, and tourists clutched boarding passes like golden tickets. Mimi moved through this human river with the fluid awareness of someone who had learned long ago to read crowds, to spot the anomalies that others missed. It was a skill that had kept her alive in places where the wrong assessment could mean the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic. Mimi, honey, the familiar voice cut through the ambient noise of the terminal. Mrs. Loretta Daniels waved from beside the newsstand, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. At 73, Loretta traveled to visit her scattered children and grandchildren with the determination of a woman who refused to let age diminish her world. She was one of the few passengers who bothered to learn Mimi's name. "Good morning, Mrs. Daniels," Mimi replied, parking her cart and walking over with a genuine smile. "Flying to see family again?" "Oh yes, dear, my youngest grandson in Phoenix. Can you believe he's already walking? Seems like yesterday Sarah was telling me she was pregnant." Loretta's eyes sparkled with the joy that only grandchildren could bring. "You know, I was coming through security yesterday, and I saw the oddest thing. These two men, very serious looking, were having the most intense conversation. Couldn't understand a word of it, of course, but something about their manner just struck me as strange." Mimi's attention sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Strange how?" "Well, they kept looking around like they were worried someone might overhear them, but who would understand them anyway? Sounded like Arabic to me, but I'm probably wrong about that. My ears aren't what they used to be." Loretta chuckled and adjusted her purse strap. "Probably just nervous flyers. Lord knows there are enough of those these days." "Did you notice anything else about them?" Mimi asked, her voice carefully casual. One was older, very composed. The younger one seemed anxious, kept checking his watch. They separated after their conversation. Went to different gates, I think. Probably nothing, but you know how your mind plays tricks on you in airports. Everything seems suspicious when you're worried about missing your flight. A loud announcement echoed overhead, calling passengers for a flight to Denver. Loretta gathered her belongings. "That's my cue, sweetheart. You take care of yourself, you hear? And don't let these people walk all over you." You're worth 10 of some of these suits rushing around here. Mimi watched Loretta disappear into the crowd, her words echoing in her mind. Arabic conversation. 2 men. Anxious behavior. Separate gates. In her former life, those details would have been immediately flagged and investigated. But that was before, when her opinions mattered, when her expertise was valued instead of dismissed. She resumed her route through the terminal, her cleaning duties providing perfect cover for observation. Near gate A15, she noticed a discarded backpack sitting unattended beside a row of chairs. Standard protocol required immediate notification of security, but experience told her to observe first. She positioned herself nearby, ostensibly cleaning windows while keeping the bag in her peripheral vision. 20 minutes passed. No one claimed it. Mimi made her way to the security checkpoint where Officer Jason Fields stood reviewing paperwork with the bored expression of someone going through motions. At 38, Fields had the soft appearance of a man who'd traded the physical demands of street patrol for the administrative comfort of airport security. His recent promotion to head of airport security had inflated his sense of authority while doing little to develop his instincts. Officer Fields, Mimi approached quietly. There's an unattended bag at gate A15. It's been sitting there for at least 20 minutes. Fields looked up from his clipboard with the expression of someone being interrupted during important work. And you're telling me this? Why? Don't you have restrooms to clean or something? I thought you should know. Standard security protocol. I know what standard security protocol is, Fields interrupted, his voice carrying the edge of someone who felt his authority being questioned by someone he considered beneath his notice. I don't need a janitor explaining security procedures to me. If there was a real threat, we'd have detected it through our systems. Quote. Mimi kept her expression neutral despite the familiar sting of dismissal. Of course, I just thought. That's the problem, you thought. Leave the thinking to the professionals, okay? We've got everything under control here. Fields turned back to his paperwork with the finality of someone who considered the conversation over. From behind the TSA checkpoint, Farah Al-Mashri watched the exchange with growing discomfort. At 26, she was new enough to the job to still remember what it felt like to be dismissed because of assumptions about her background. The daughter of Egyptian immigrants, she'd grown up navigating the space between two cultures, learning early how to read the subtle signs of prejudice disguised as professionalism. She'd been watching Mimi for weeks, noting the older woman's quiet competence and the way she seemed to see things others missed. There was something about Mimi's bearing that didn't match her job title. A precision in her movements, an awareness in her eyes that spoke of training that went far beyond janitorial work. Mimi, Farah called softly as the older woman turned to leave. Could I speak with you for a moment? Fields looked up with irritation. Al-Masri, don't you have passengers to screen? Just finished a shift rotation, sir. Taking my break. Farah's response was professional but firm. Mimi approached the checkpoint, noting the supportive look in Farah's eyes. What can I do for you? The bag you mentioned. Has anyone claimed it yet? No, it's still there. Farah glanced at Fields, who was pointedly ignoring their conversation, then back to Mimi. What's your assessment? The question surprised Mimi. It was the first time in years someone had asked for her assessment rather than her compliance. Could be nothing, could be something. In my experience, it's better to err on the side of caution. Your experience? Farah's tone was curious rather than skeptical. Mimi met her eyes for a moment, seeing genuine interest rather than condescension. I've been around airports for a while. You learn to notice patterns. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all she was willing to share. The whole truth involved convoy security in Iraq, threat assessment training at Fort Gordon, and a Distinguished Service Medal that currently held down a stack of bills in her modest apartment. The whole truth involved languages and dialects, cultural nuances and behavioral indicators that could mean the difference between catching a threat and missing one entirely. Farah nodded slowly. I'll take a walk by gate A15 during my next break. If the bag's still there, I'll follow up on it. Thank you. Mimi's gratitude was genuine. It's probably nothing, but probably isn't good enough when it comes to passenger safety, Farah finished. Fields looked up from his paperwork with an expression of exaggerated patience. Are you two quite finished? Some of us have actual work to do. Mimi nodded to Farah and returned to her cart. As she moved through the terminal, she couldn't shake the feeling that Loretta's observation about the two men was more significant than casual travel anxiety. The combination of nervous behavior, Arabic conversation, and deliberate separation to different gates fit patterns she'd been trained to recognize. But those patterns belonged to a world where her expertise mattered, where her observations led to action rather than dismissal. She made her way toward the restroom facilities near Gate C7, her cleaning supplies providing the perfect cover for the kind of systematic observation that had once been her profession. The afternoon crowd was building, and the terminal hummed with the energy of thousands of people in transit. Somewhere in this crowd, her instincts told her something was wrong. The question was whether anyone would listen when she found it. The women's restroom near Gate C7 was nearly empty when Mimi entered, her cartwheels squeaking softly on the polished floor. The afternoon lull between flight schedules created these pockets of relative quiet throughout the terminal, moments when the constant rush of travelers briefly subsided. She began her routine, checking supply levels, wiping down surfaces, ensuring everything met the standards that kept passengers moving through their journeys without a second thought about the invisible hands that maintained their comfort. The automatic paper towel dispenser needed refilling, and as she opened the supply cabinet, she heard voices from the family restroom at the far end of the facility. 2 male voices, speaking in low, urgent tones. At first, she paid little attention. Travelers used family restrooms for phone calls, private conversations, small children's needs. But something about the cadence of their speech made her pause. They were speaking Arabic. Mimi's hands stilled on the paper towel supplies. The dialect was specific, unmistakable to someone who had spent years immersed in the linguistic landscape of the Middle East. Syrian coastal Arabic, with the particular inflections that marked speakers from the Latakia region. It was a dialect she'd encountered countless times during her years as a military linguist, embedded with units operating throughout Syria and neighboring countries. In her civilian life, hearing Arabic in an airport was unremarkable. Atlanta's international terminal hosted travelers from every corner of the globe. But this conversation carried undertones that triggered instincts buried beneath years of deliberate normalcy. The rhythm was wrong, too careful, too measured with the kind of coded language she'd been trained to recognize. The cleansing must be complete, one voice said, the older voice, calm and controlled. No room for doubt or hesitation. I understand, replied the younger voice, tension evident in every syllable. But the timing, 15:27, is so soon. Are you certain the preparations are sufficient? Mimi's blood chilled. In the coded language of extremist operations, cleansing was never metaphorical, and 15:27, 3:27 p.m. was less than an hour away. The gift has been placed according to instructions, the older voice continued. Terminal B, as discussed. The gate is cleared, the crowds are substantial, the message will be unmistakable. Gift. In the sanitized language of terrorism, explosives were often referred to as gifts. Mimi forced herself to continue her routine cleaning, her movements automatic while her mind raced through the implications. Terminal B was the international departure wing, constantly crowded with passengers from dozens of countries. At 3:27 p.m., the afternoon departure rush would be at its peak. What about the secondary position? The younger voice asked. You handle your assignment. I handle mine. When the first message arrives, security will focus their attention where we want it. The true gift will follow 10 minutes later. 2 devices, a decoy and a primary target. The classic misdirection pattern that had been analyzed in countless briefings she'd attended during her military service. Create chaos and draw response resources to one location while the real attack unfolds elsewhere. The conversation shifted to logistics, timing sequences, evacuation patterns, communication protocols. Every word confirmed Mimi's worst fears. This wasn't hypothetical planning or academic discussion. This was operational language from people who had studied their target environment and prepared for immediate execution. A flush echoed from the family restroom, followed by the sound of running water. Mimi quickly moved to a position where she could observe their exit without being obvious. Through the reflection in the mirror above the sinks, she watched 2 men emerge from the family restroom. The older man matched Loretta's description perfectly, composed, confident, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His clothes were unremarkable business casual, his appearance designed to blend seamlessly with the international business travelers who filled the terminal. But his eyes carried the cold calculation of someone for whom human life was merely a tactical consideration. The younger man was clearly uncomfortable, his nervous energy barely contained beneath a veneer of attempted composure. He kept checking his watch, his hands trembling slightly as he attempted to project confidence he obviously didn't feel. His discomfort would have been invisible to casual observers, but Mimi recognized the signs of someone struggling with the reality of impending violence. They spoke briefly in English as they washed their hands, casual comments about flight schedules and travel delays that would seem perfectly normal to anyone overhearing. But Mimi caught the subtle emphasis on certain words, the coded confirmations embedded in seemingly innocent conversation. "Terminal B should be clear by 4, the older man said casually. "I'll be in position well before then," the younger man replied. They separated without obvious acknowledgement, the older man heading toward the main concourse while the younger walked in the direction of the domestic terminals. Mimi memorized every detail she could. The older man's dark leather shoes with a distinctive scuff on the left toe, the younger man's nervous habit of touching his left pocket, the particular way he favored his right leg, as if compensating for an old injury. As soon as they were out of sight, Mimi abandoned her cleaning cart and moved quickly toward the restroom's exit. The terminal's public address system crackled with routine announcements, gate changes, boarding calls, security reminders. Normal airport sounds that now carried an overlay of urgency only she could fully appreciate. Her military training had taught her to compartmentalize crisis response, assess the threat, identify resources, develop options, execute action. But that training had been conducted in environments where her expertise was respected, where chains of command led to decisive action rather than bureaucratic dismissal. The nearest security station was 50 yards away, where Officer Fields would likely be reviewing paperwork or conducting routine administrative tasks. Every instinct told her that approaching him again would result in the same dismissal she'd experienced an hour earlier. But the alternative, allowing a terrorist attack to proceed while she possessed actionable intelligence, was unthinkable. She thought of her husband David, killed by an IED outside Kandahar during his 3rd deployment. He died because intelligence warnings had been delayed, dismissed, or lost in bureaucratic channels. The investigation afterward had revealed a pattern of missed signals and institutional failures that could have prevented his death if someone had acted on imperfect information rather than waiting for perfect confirmation. Mimi had attended briefings where analysts discussed the psychology of terrorism, the way extremist operations relied on the hesitation of authorities, the tendency of security systems to dismiss threats that didn't arrive through official channels. The men she'd overheard were counting on exactly the kind of institutional skepticism that Fields had already demonstrated. But she also understood the reality of her position. A janitor reporting terrorist activity based on overheard conversation would be dismissed as paranoid, attention-seeking, or simply mistaken. Without corroborating evidence or credible authority, her warning would likely be filed away as the kind of false alarm that security personnel received dozens of times each week. As she walked toward the security checkpoint, Mimi made a decision that would have been automatic during her military service, but now required conscious courage. She would report what she'd heard, accept whatever dismissal or ridicule followed, and then take independent action to prevent the attack she knew was coming. The weight of that decision settled on her shoulders like the familiar burden of equipment she'd carried through hostile territory years before. The tools were different now, mop instead of rifle, uniform instead of body armor, but the fundamental responsibility remained unchanged. When ordinary people faced extraordinary threats, someone had to act, regardless of whether anyone believed them. Officer Jason Fields looked up from his clipboard with the weary expression of someone who'd been interrupted too many times during what should have been a quiet afternoon shift. When he saw Mimi approaching, his face shifted to barely concealed irritation. "Let me guess," he said before she could speak. "Another unattended bag? Suspicious passenger? Tourist taking too many pictures?" His tone carried the practiced condescension of someone who'd decided that his authority was being challenged by people who didn't understand the complexities of his job. "Officer Fields, I need to report a conversation I overheard. 2 men were discussing what appears to be a coordinated attack planned for this afternoon." Mimi kept her voice level and professional, drawing on years of military briefing experience. Fields actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that carried across the security checkpoint. "A conversation that you overheard while cleaning toilets." He shook his head as if dealing with a particularly persistent child. "Lady, do you have any idea how many conversations happen in this airport every day? Do you know how many of those get reported as suspicious by people who watch too much cable news? They were speaking Arabic. They mentioned specific times, terminal locations, and used coded language consistent with operational planning. Mimi's training had taught her to present intelligence in clear, factual terms that allowed decision-makers to assess threats without emotional influence. Arabic. Fields repeated the word as if it explained everything. So now, speaking Arabic is suspicious? Do you realize what kind of discrimination lawsuit we'd be facing if we investigated every Arabic conversation in an international airport? He turned to a nearby TSA agent. Hey, Martinez, come listen to this. Our janitor here thinks she's uncovered a terrorist plot. Martinez approached with the expression of someone expecting entertainment rather than a legitimate security briefing. What's the story? She overheard some Arabic conversation and thinks it's a terrorist attack. Apparently, cleaning supplies come with intelligence training now. Fields' tone made it clear he expected Martinez to share his amusement. But Martinez didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at Mimi with something approaching curiosity. What exactly did you hear? Quote, Mimi felt a flicker of hope. Two men discussing operational timing for what they called cleansing. They mentioned Terminal B at 15:27. That's about 40 minutes from now. They referenced a gift being placed and secondary positioning. One mentioned drawing security attention while the true gift follows 10 minutes later. Martinez's expression grew more serious. That's pretty specific language. It's also pretty convenient, Fields interrupted. Amazing how she happened to understand this conversation perfectly and remembered every detail. You know what I think? I think someone's been watching too many action movies and wants to feel important. From her position at the TSA checkpoint, Farah Al-Masri had been listening to the exchange while processing a passenger's carry-on items. The dismissive tone in Fields' voice triggered memories of countless similar moments in her own life, times when her observations had been dismissed because of assumptions about her background or capabilities. She finished with her passenger and approached the group. Excuse me, but did you say they mentioned Terminal B at 15:27? Fields looked at her with growing irritation. Don't tell me you're buying into this fantasy too, Al-Masri. I'm just wondering if there might be a way to verify the information, Farah replied carefully. If someone wanted to check passenger manifests for the time period mentioned, or review security camera footage from the areas she identified. We don't waste resources chasing ghost stories, Fields cut her off. And we definitely don't let civilian employees dictate security protocols. This conversation is over. He turned back to Mimi with the expression of someone whose patience had been exhausted. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back to your assigned duties and stick to cleaning things. You're not going to approach security personnel with any more of these stories. And if you continue to disrupt operations with these delusions, we'll be having a conversation with your supervisor about whether you're suitable for airport employment. Mimi absorbed the threat without visible reaction. She'd faced similar dismissals before, in military briefings where junior officers dismissed intelligence from sources they considered unreliable. But those dismissals had usually been overruled by senior commanders who understood that threats rarely arrived through convenient channels. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Officer Fields, she said quietly, in approximately 35 minutes, people are going to die. I understand you don't believe me. I understand you think I'm just a janitor with an overactive imagination. But when those people die, and when the investigation afterward reveals that someone tried to warn you, I want you to remember this conversation. The absolute certainty in her voice seemed to give Fields pause, but only for a moment. Is that supposed to be a threat? It's a prediction, based on information you're choosing to ignore. Mimi turned to leave, then stopped. When the first explosion happens, they're counting on security responding to Terminal B. The real attack will come 10 minutes later, somewhere else. Remember that at least. She walked away before Fields could respond, leaving him standing beside Martinez and Farah with an expression of uncertainty that hadn't been there minutes before. Farah waited until Mimi was out of earshot before speaking. Sir, what if she's right? She's not right, Fields replied, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. She's a janitor who speaks Arabic and watches too much TV. People like that see conspiracies everywhere. People like what? Farah's tone sharpened. Fields caught himself, realizing he'd stepped closer to overt discrimination than his position could tolerate. People without proper training. civilians who don't understand the difference between casual conversation and actual threats. But Martinez was already moving toward a computer terminal. Doesn't hurt to check, though. What did she say? Terminal B at 1527. I can pull up the departure schedule, see what flights are boarding around that time. Martinez, don't waste time on this. It's my time to waste, Martinez replied. And if she's wrong, we've lost 5 minutes checking a computer screen. If she's right, and we ignored it. He left the sentence unfinished. Farah joined him at the terminal. I can access passenger manifests for flights departing from Terminal B between 3 and 4 p.m. If there are any names that match watch lists or show unusual booking patterns. Fields found himself caught between his instinct to maintain authority and a growing seed of doubt. The janitor had spoken with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. Her terminology had been precise, her assessment systematic, and despite his assumptions about her background, there had been something in her bearing that suggested experience with exactly these kinds of situations. Fine, he said reluctantly. 5 minutes. But when this turns out to be nothing, I don't want to hear another word about terrorist janitors or Arabic conspiracies. As Martinez and Farah began pulling up flight information and passenger data, Fields found himself thinking about standard operating procedures for threat assessment. The official guidelines emphasized that credible threats could come from any source and should be evaluated based on specificity and actionable intelligence rather than the perceived reliability of the reporting party. But those guidelines had been written by people who'd never dealt with the daily reality of false alarms, attention seekers, and genuine mistakes that could shut down entire terminals based on misunderstood conversations or cultural misinterpretations. 20 yards away, Mimi was already formulating her own response plan. She'd done what protocol required, reported the threat to appropriate authorities. Their failure to act didn't absolve her of responsibility to prevent the attack she knew was coming. She thought of the younger man's nervous energy, his obvious discomfort with the operation he'd committed to supporting. In her experience, that kind of psychological profile represented both a danger and an opportunity. He was the weak link in their operational security, but also the most likely to make mistakes that could expose the entire plan. Finding him in a terminal complex that accommodated over 100,000 passengers daily would normally be impossible. But Mimi had advantages that the men hadn't considered when they dismissed her as an invisible service worker. She had access to areas where passengers couldn't go, knowledge of sightlines and service corridors that weren't visible to casual observers, and most importantly, the trained ability to track targets through crowded environments. Her cart was still beside the restroom where she'd abandoned it. She returned to collect it, using the movement to scan the concourse for any sign of the two men. The younger one had headed toward domestic terminals, which narrowed the search area significantly. His nervous behavior would make him stand out to someone who knew what to look for. As she moved through the terminal, Mimi reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 10 years ago, she'd been briefing senior military commanders on threat assessments that could affect thousands of troops. Today, she was being dismissed by airport security while trying to prevent civilian casualties. The irony was bitter, but not surprising. She'd learned long ago that competence and authority were often inversely related, that the people most eager to dismiss warnings were frequently those least qualified to assess them. But she'd also learned that individual action could compensate for institutional failure, that someone willing to act on imperfect information could often achieve what entire bureaucracies could not. The hunt for the younger man began with systematic observation patterns she'd learned during counterintelligence training. Check obvious locations first. Food courts, charging stations, areas where nervous travelers typically congregated while waiting for connections. Note behavioral anomalies. Someone checking time repeatedly, avoiding eye contact with security personnel, positioning themselves with clear exit routes. In the distance, she could see Farah and Martinez still working at their computer terminal, while Fields watched with growing agitation. Whether their investigation would yield actionable intelligence remained to be seen. But Mimi knew from experience that preventing attacks often depended on individual initiative rather than institutional response. The clock on the terminal wall read 2:52 p.m., 35 minutes, until the first device was scheduled to detonate. Time enough to find the younger man, assess his state of mind, and determine whether he could be turned or neutralized before the operation proceeded. Time enough if she moved quickly and trusted the instincts that had kept her alive during 3 deployments in hostile territory. Time enough if she was willing to risk everything on the certainty that some threats were too important to ignore, regardless of who believed them. Mimi moved through the terminal with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to hunt in crowded environments. Her janitorial cart provided perfect camouflage. Passengers' eyes slid past service workers with the same unconscious dismissal that had protected her during covert operations in civilian areas overseas. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very invisibility which frustrated her civilian life now became her greatest tactical advantage. She started with the domestic terminal's main food court, a natural gathering point for nervous travelers killing time before flights. The younger man's anxiety would drive him toward familiar patterns, seeking comfort in routine activities while his mind processed the weight of what he'd committed to do. Mimi had seen the same behavior in informants preparing to betray their associates, the way fear manifested in seemingly normal actions performed with unusual intensity. The lunch crowd provided excellent cover as she systematically scanned faces and body language. Near the Starbucks, she spotted him. He sat alone at a small table, ostensibly reading a newspaper while nursing a coffee that had clearly gone cold. But his eyes weren't tracking the text. They moved constantly between the terminal clock and the departure boards, the same nervous pattern she'd observed earlier. His left hand kept touching his jacket pocket, a self-soothing gesture that suggested he was carrying something significant. Jamal Sadi, according to the conversation she'd overheard, though she doubted that was his real name. Mid-20s, with the soft features of someone who'd lived a comfortable life until recently. His nervous energy marked him as the operation's weak link. Recruited online, radicalized through manipulation rather than genuine conviction, probably promised glory he was now too frightened to pursue. Mimi positioned herself at a nearby table, using her cart as a blind while she observed his behavioral patterns. Every few minutes, he checked his phone, typed brief messages, then deleted them without sending. Classic signs of someone struggling with commitment to an irreversible action. She needed to get closer to assess whether he could be turned, or if intervention would simply accelerate their timeline. But first, she had to ensure backup was available. From her pocket, she retrieved her personal phone and scrolled to a contact she hadn't used in 3 years. David Kim had flown recon missions over Syria during the same period when Mimi was conducting ground intelligence operations. Their paths had crossed during joint briefings, and they'd maintained the loose professional connection that linked veterans who'd served in classified operations. He now flew commercial routes for Delta, and according to his last message, he was scheduled for an Atlanta layover this afternoon. She typed carefully, D. Mimi Haddad. Remember Latakia Intel Ops 2019? Need immediate assistance Hartsfield Terminal B. Credible threat 1,527 hours. Can you confirm your location? The response came within 30 seconds. Terminal F crew rest area. What kind of threat? Coordinated explosive devices. 2 suspects. Arabic speakers. Operational language confirmed. Security dismissing intelligence. Needs someone with clearance to verify. On my way. Terminal B main security desk? Negative. Meet near gate B47 in 10 minutes. Come alone and low profile. She pocketed the phone and refocused on Jamal. He'd finished his coffee and was gathering his belongings, moving with the reluctant determination of someone forcing himself toward an unpleasant but necessary task. This was her moment. Before he linked up with his handler, before their operational security tightened, before innocent people died because she'd failed to act on actionable intelligence. Mimi abandoned her cart near the food court restroom and began following Jamal through the terminal. Her years of surveillance training came back with muscle memory precision, maintaining distance, using crowds and architecture for concealment, anticipating his route based on behavioral cues and terminal layout. He was heading toward the international gates, moving against the flow of departing passengers with the awkward gait of someone unfamiliar with the airport's geography. Several times he paused to check directional signs, confirming Mimi's assessment that he was operating outside his comfort zone. Near gate B34, he stopped beside a bank of charging stations and withdrew his phone again. This time, instead of typing and deleting messages, he placed a call. Mimi moved within earshot, using a nearby newsstand as cover while straining to catch fragments of his conversation. He was speaking English now, but his voice carried the particular stress patterns of someone communicating in a second language under pressure. "Yes, I'm in position," she heard him say, "but I'm not sure about the timing. There are so many people here, families with children." His voice trailed off as someone on the other end interrupted him. "I understand the necessity," he continued after a moment, "but surely there's another way to send the message without—" Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, I remember what they did to my cousin. I remember why we're here." The conversation ended abruptly. Jamal stood motionless for several seconds, then walked to a nearby restroom. Mimi gave him a 30-second head start before following. The men's restroom was empty, except for Jamal, who stood at the far sink staring at his reflection with the expression of someone questioning every decision that had led him to this moment. Mimi entered quietly, checking the stalls to ensure they were alone. "Jamal," she said softly in Arabic, "you don't have to do this." He spun around, terror flashing across his features as he registered not just her presence but her use of his name. "Who are you? How do you know?" "I know because I was listening when you and Imran discussed the operation." "I know because I understand the language you thought no one else would recognize." Mimi kept her voice calm, non-threatening. "And I know because I can see in your eyes that you're not a killer." Jamal's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket pocket, but Mimi raised her hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'm not armed. I'm not security. I'm just someone who's trying to prevent a tragedy that will haunt you for the rest of your life." "You don't understand," Jamal whispered. "They killed my family. The drone strike in Aleppo. My cousin was only 12 years old. They call it collateral damage, but he was just a boy riding his bicycle." "I understand more than you know," Mimi replied in Arabic, switching to the Aleppo dialect she'd learned during her deployments. "I've seen what war does to innocent people. I've held children who died because adults couldn't find better ways to resolve their anger." The familiar dialect seemed to shake something loose in Jamal's psychological defenses. "You were there, in Syria?" "For 3 years. I saw the drone strikes, the civilian casualties, the families torn apart by decisions made in boardrooms thousands of miles away. I know the rage you're carrying, the need to make someone pay for losses that can never be repaid." Jamal leaned against the sink, his composure cracking. "Then you understand why this has to happen." "I understand why you think it has to happen, but killing innocent people won't bring your cousin back. It will just create more families like yours, more children who grow up wanting revenge for losses they can't comprehend. The message has to be sent. They have to understand. The only message this will send is that you're no different from the people who killed your family, that you're willing to sacrifice children to make a political point." Mimi stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Your cousin wouldn't want this. No 12-year-old boy would want his death used to justify killing other children." Tears began flowing down Jamal's cheeks, the psychological pressure of his internal conflict finally overwhelming his attempts at operational discipline. "But if I back out now, Imran will know. He'll find another way, and he'll make sure I pay for betraying the cause." "Imran is using your grief to manipulate you into becoming something you're not. Look at yourself. Look at what he's turned you into. Is this who you want to be?" Jamal pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands. "He's been texting instructions all morning. Device locations, timing sequences, backup plans if something goes wrong. He doesn't trust me to remember everything." Mimi's pulse quickened. "Show me." For a moment, Jamal hesitated, caught between loyalty to his handler and the moral clarity that Mimi's words had awakened. Then, with the defeated gesture of someone accepting an inevitable reckoning, he handed her the phone. The text messages confirmed her worst fears and provided crucial intelligence. 2 devices. One in Terminal B set to detonate at 3:27 p.m. Another in Terminal A scheduled for 3:37 p.m. The first was positioned near the international departure gates, designed to create chaos and draw emergency response resources. The second, larger device was hidden in a service corridor near the domestic security checkpoint, where the explosion would collapse structural supports and trap hundreds of passengers. "Where exactly are these devices?" Mimi asked, scrolling through the messages. "The first one is in a luggage locker near gate B47. The second—" Jamal's voice broke. "It's in the janitor's closet on level 2, directly below the main security checkpoint. When it goes off, it will bring down the entire section." Mimi memorized the locations and timing while calculating response options. With less than 20 minutes until the first detonation, traditional bomb disposal protocols would be impossible. But the message thread also revealed operational details that could be exploited. Device types, trigger mechanisms, communication protocols. Jamal, listen to me carefully. Are you willing to help stop this? He nodded miserably. I never wanted to hurt innocent people. Imran said it would be symbolic, that we'd target government officials and military personnel. But when I saw the crowds today, all the families, he couldn't finish the sentence. Then we're going to save those families. But I need you to trust me and do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that? Yes, Jamal whispered. What do you need me to do? Mimi emerged from the restroom with Jamal's phone clutched in her hand and a sense of desperate urgency driving every step. The device locations and timing were now confirmed, but convincing airport security to act on intelligence from a janitor and a confessed terrorist remained an almost insurmountable challenge. She had 16 minutes to overcome institutional skepticism and coordinate a response that could save hundreds of lives. As she approached the security checkpoint where Officer Fields was still stationed, she could see Farah and Martinez huddled over a computer terminal, their body language suggesting they'd found something significant in their passenger manifest review. Fields stood nearby with his arms crossed, clearly annoyed at the time being spent on what he still considered a pointless exercise. Officer Fields, Mimi called out, her voice carrying an authority that made several nearby passengers turn to look. I have confirmation of the threat. Device locations, timing, and operational details. Fields looked up with an expression of theatrical exasperation. Oh, for the love of, you're still going on about this? I thought I made it clear that you need to stick to your actual job instead of playing counterterrorism expert. Mimi held up Jamal's phone. Text messages from the operational commander. 2 devices, Terminal B, Gate 47 area, detonation scheduled for 1527. Terminal A, Level 2 janitor's closet below the security checkpoint, 1537. The first device is a decoy designed to draw response resources away from the primary target. The specificity of her information gave Fields pause, but his commitment to dismissing her had become a matter of personal authority. And where exactly did you get this supposed intelligence? Did your imaginary terrorists just hand you their phones? I obtained it from one of the conspirators who's having second thoughts about killing innocent people. He's currently in the Terminal B men's restroom near Gate B34, willing to cooperate with authorities if treated as a material witness rather than an enemy combatant. Martinez looked up from his computer screen. Sir, I'm seeing some anomalies in the passenger data. 2 individuals with recently issued passports, paid for tickets in cash, no checked luggage, and no return flights scheduled. Both listed Arabic surnames but U.S. addresses that don't show up in any residential databases. Farah joined the conversation with a printed manifest in her hands. The flight departing from Gate B47 at 1545 shows an unusual number of last-minute cancellations. 12 passengers who checked in online but never showed up at the gate. That's statistically significant for an international departure. Fields found himself surrounded by information that challenged his assumptions, but his pride demanded continued resistance. So we have some questionable passenger data and a janitor claiming to have terrorist text messages. That's not exactly ironclad evidence. Mimi looked at him with the steady gaze of someone who'd faced much more dangerous skeptics in much more critical situations. Officer Fields, in approximately 15 minutes, an explosive device will detonate near Gate B47. When that happens, your entire security team will respond to Terminal B, exactly as the attackers planned. 10 minutes later, while your people are focused on rescue operations and evacuation procedures, a larger device will destroy the structural supports beneath this checkpoint. She gestured to the crowded security lines around them. These people, these families, these children, will be trapped in collapsing concrete and twisted metal because you refuse to take seriously intelligence that could save their lives. Intelligence, Fields repeated with a bitter laugh, from a janitor who speaks Arabic and claims to have terrorist contacts. Do you have any idea how insane that sounds? It sounds exactly like the kind of unconventional intelligence that prevented dozens of attacks during my 15 years as a military linguist, Mimi replied calmly. It sounds like the kind of information that gets dismissed by people who value their authority more than other people's lives. The terminal's public address system crackled with a routine boarding announcement, but the sound seemed ominous against the backdrop of their conversation. Passengers moved through security lines, with the casual confidence of people who trusted that others were protecting them from threats they couldn't imagine. Farah stepped forward with the courage of someone who'd finally decided to risk her career for her principles. "Sir, I've been watching this woman for weeks. She notices things other people miss. She understands languages and cultural nuances that could be valuable for security operations, and she's never once been wrong about anything I've seen her assess." "Al-Masri, you're out of line," Fields warned. "No, sir. I'm speaking up for someone whose expertise you're dismissing because of assumptions about her job title." Farah's voice carried the strength of someone who'd found her moral center. "If she's wrong, we've wasted 20 minutes checking some luggage lockers and service areas. If she's right and we ignore her, people are going to die." Martinez closed his laptop and stood up. "I'm with Al-Masri on this. The passenger data is suspicious enough to warrant investigation, and frankly, this woman knows more about threat assessment than anyone else I've seen in this terminal." Fields looked around the security checkpoint, realizing that his authority was being challenged not just by Mimi, but by his own subordinates. The comfortable certainty of his position was crumbling under the weight of information he couldn't easily dismiss, and the moral pressure of colleagues who were willing to act on imperfect intelligence. "Even if I believed this fairy tale," he said reluctantly, "I don't have authority to initiate terminal-wide bomb disposal operations based on hearsay and suspicious passenger lists. That would require federal coordination, evacuation protocols, and clearance from people way above my pay grade." Mimi pulled out her personal phone and showed him David Kim's contact information. "Captain David Kim, Delta Airlines, former Air Force intelligence officer with current security clearance. He's en route to verify my background and assess the threat. Will you at least wait 5 minutes before dismissing the possibility that I might be right?" For the first time since their conversation began, Fields hesitated. The mention of a military intelligence officer with current clearance changed the calculus of his decision. Even if the threat was fabricated, ignoring military personnel who were willing to stake their reputations on its validity could have serious consequences for his career. 5 minutes, he said grudgingly. "But when this turns out to be nothing, I want you transferred to a different terminal. I can't have my security operations disrupted by employees who think they're secret agents." Mimi nodded acceptance of his terms, knowing that in 5 minutes, the nature of their relationship would be fundamentally different. Either she would be vindicated by David's arrival and the confirmation of the threat, or she would be dismissed as delusional and lose the job that provided her only connection to the world of security operations. As they waited, the terminal clock advanced to 3:12 p.m., 15 minutes until the first device was scheduled to detonate. Somewhere in the terminal, Imran was probably making final preparations, confident that his careful planning and psychological manipulation had created an unstoppable operation. But he hadn't counted on the conscience of his youngest recruit or the expertise of a janitor whose invisibility had become her greatest weapon in the war against those who thought ordinary people couldn't fight back against extraordinary evil. David Kim appeared at the security checkpoint with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command authority. At 45, he carried himself with the bearing of a military officer despite his civilian pilot's uniform. His presence immediately shifted the dynamics of the group gathered around Officer Fields, bringing a gravitas that even Fields couldn't dismiss. "Captain Kim, Delta Airlines," he announced, showing his credentials to Fields while making eye contact with Mimi. "I understand there's been a security concern raised by Ms. Haddad." Fields straightened reflexively in the presence of someone whose authority clearly outranked his own. "Captain, we have a civilian employee claiming to have intelligence about terrorist devices. I'm sure you understand our position regarding unsubstantiated." "I understand that Miriam Haddad served 3 deployments as a signals intelligence specialist with the 101st Airborne," David interrupted. "I understand that she speaks fluent Arabic, Farsi, and Kurdish, and that she provided threat assessments that prevented 17 confirmed attacks against U.S. personnel in Syria and Iraq." The security checkpoint fell silent except for the routine sounds of passengers moving through screening procedures. Fields' expression shifted from skepticism to uncertainty, as the credentials he dismissed as fabricated were confirmed by someone whose authority he couldn't question. Furthermore, David continued, I understand that she holds a Distinguished Service Medal for actions that prevented a truck bomb attack against a forward operating base in Kandahar. So when she contacts me about a credible threat in this terminal, I take that communication very seriously. Mimi felt a surge of gratitude for David's public validation, but her focus remained on the countdown that was continuing regardless of their bureaucratic discussions. Captain Kim, I've confirmed device locations and timing through direct source intelligence. We have 12 minutes until the first detonation. David nodded grimly. What do you need? Bomb disposal isn't possible with the available time, but the devices are remotely triggered through cell phone activation. If we can identify and jam the specific frequencies being used, we can prevent detonation long enough to implement evacuation procedures. How do we identify the frequencies? Mimi held up Jamal's phone. Text messages from the operational commander include technical specifications for the trigger mechanisms. Standard commercial cell phones modified with additional receivers for backup activation. We need to contact air traffic control and request emergency frequency jamming for cellular bands in the terminal area. David pulled out his phone and began dialing. I have contacts in ATC who can implement jamming protocols, but we'll need federal authorization for interference with civilian communications. How long does that take? Farah asked. Under normal circumstances, several hours. In an emergency situation with military personnel vouching for the threat, David paused his dialing to look at Fields. It depends on whether local security is willing to request federal assistance based on the intelligence we have. All eyes turned to Fields, who found himself facing the decision he'd been trying to avoid. Requesting federal intervention would validate Mimi's warnings and acknowledge his initial dismissal as a potentially catastrophic error in judgment. But refusing to act would make him personally responsible for any casualties that resulted from his bureaucratic inflexibility. What exactly are you asking me to authorize? He asked reluctantly. Contact FBI counterterrorism and request emergency frequency jamming for the terminal area, David replied. Coordinate with bomb disposal units to secure the device locations identified by Ms. Haddad, and implement partial evacuation procedures for the areas surrounding the suspected devices. Fields looked at the crowded security checkpoint, imagining the chaos that evacuation procedures would create. If we evacuate and there's no actual threat, this terminal will be shut down for hours. Thousands of passengers will miss flights, airline schedules will be disrupted, and the economic impact will be enormous. If we don't evacuate and there is a threat, the economic impact will be irrelevant because we'll be dealing with mass casualties, Mimi said quietly. Sir, I've given you everything I can. Source intelligence, device locations, timing, operational details. I can't make the decision for you, but I can tell you that in 10 minutes, your choice will become academic. Martinez stepped forward with his laptop. Sir, I can confirm that the passenger data supports Ms. Haddad's assessment. We have multiple indicators of coordinated activity by individuals using fraudulent identification. That alone justifies heightened security measures. Fair joined him, holding printed security camera stills. I've been reviewing footage from the areas Ms. Haddad identified. 2 individuals placed items in locations that match her intelligence. One near Gate B47, another in the service corridor she mentioned. Fields realized he was surrounded by subordinates who were willing to act on the intelligence he'd dismissed, federal authority that validated the source's credibility, and specific evidence that corroborated the threat assessment. His personal pride was now the only obstacle preventing response to what appeared to be a genuine terrorist operation. 10 minutes, he said finally. Captain Kim, make your calls. Martinez, contact FBI counterterrorism and explain the situation. Al-Masri, begin discreet evacuation of the areas around those device locations. Try not to create a panic, but get people away from the potential blast zones. David was already on the phone with air traffic control, speaking in the rapid technical language of someone coordinating emergency procedures. Mimi could hear fragments of his conversation: frequency bands, emergency authorization codes, federal intervention protocols. Meanwhile, Martinez was explaining the situation to FBI personnel who were clearly struggling to process the unconventional nature of the intelligence source. Yes, sir, I understand how it sounds. But we have confirmation from military intelligence personnel and specific evidence that supports the threat assessment. Farah began implementing evacuation procedures with the subtle efficiency of someone trained to manage crowd control without creating panic. She approached gate agents and maintenance personnel, quietly requesting that they begin moving passengers away from the identified areas using routine operational excuses: gate changes, maintenance requirements, security inspections. Mimi felt the familiar tension of operational countdown, the psychological pressure of watching time compress while complex procedures unfolded. She'd experienced it during military operations where success depended on coordinating multiple moving parts under extreme time pressure. But this was different. In military operations, she'd been part of a team trained to work together under pressure. Here, she was trying to coordinate civilian personnel who'd never faced anything like this, using authorities and protocols they'd only read about in training manuals. The terminal clock showed 3:19 p.m., 8 minutes until the first device was scheduled to detonate. David finished his phone call and turned to the group. ATC is implementing emergency frequency jamming in 60 seconds. They can maintain it for 30 minutes before civilian communication disruption becomes legally problematic. Is that enough time? Fields asked. It's enough time to prevent remote detonation and begin bomb disposal procedures, Mimi replied. But we still need to locate Imran before he realizes his communication with the devices has been compromised. If he suspects the operation has been exposed, he may try manual activation or accelerate his timeline. Where is he? Mimi checked Jamal's phone for the most recent message exchange. Based on his last communication, he should be positioned near Terminal A, monitoring the security response to the first device. When that doesn't detonate as scheduled, he'll know something's wrong. How do we find him? We don't, Mimi said grimly. He finds us. When the jamming starts and his devices don't respond, he'll try to determine what went wrong. That means he'll be looking for Jamal. And Jamal is still in the restroom where I left him. Quote, David understood immediately. You want to use Jamal as bait. I want to give Imran a chance to surrender before this situation escalates beyond anyone's control, Mimi corrected. But yes, Jamal is our connection to him, and Imran will try to make contact when his operation fails. The terminal's public address system crackled with an announcement about gate changes affecting several flights departing from Terminal B. To most passengers, it sounded like routine operational adjustments, but Mimi recognized it as Farah's evacuation procedure in action. 3:21 p.m. 6 minutes until a bomb that would not explode as planned, but which still represented a deadly threat to everyone in the terminal until it could be safely disarmed. The frequency jamming began at exactly 3:21 p.m., creating an invisible electronic barrier that severed Imran's communication with his carefully placed devices. Throughout the terminal, passengers noticed minor disruptions: dropped phone calls, sluggish data connections, brief interruptions in Wi-Fi service. But for Mimi, watching the clock approach 3:27 p.m. without the chaos of explosions and emergency sirens, the jamming represented the first tactical victory in a battle she was finally equipped to fight. David stood beside her at the security checkpoint, monitoring multiple phone conversations with federal agencies while coordinating with airport operations. His presence had transformed the response from Fields' reluctant compliance to full institutional support. FBI counterterrorism units were en route, bomb disposal teams were positioning near the identified device locations, and emergency protocols were being implemented with the efficiency of well-rehearsed procedures. Jamming is holding steady, David reported after ending another call. Bomb disposal confirms they've located the device near Gate B47. It's exactly where your intelligence indicated. Luggage locker 247, timing mechanism visible, appears to be C4 with cell phone trigger. What about the second device? Mimi asked. Team is moving into position now. Service corridor access is more complicated, but they should have visual confirmation within 5 minutes. Fields was coordinating passenger movement with a level of urgency that would have been unthinkable 30 minutes earlier. The man who'd dismissed Mimi as delusional was now hanging on her every word, seeking guidance from someone whose expertise he'd finally accepted. Ms. Haddad, should we be implementing full terminal evacuation? Not yet. Panic evacuation could create more casualties than controlled detonation if people are trampled or injured in the rush. Keep moving people away from the blast zones, but maintain normal operational appearance until the devices are secured. Farah approached with updated security camera footage. I've been tracking movement patterns around both device locations. The individuals who placed them are no longer in those areas, but I have clear facial recognition images for both. Mimi reviewed the stills, confirming what she already knew. That's Imran and Jamal. Imran is probably trying to figure out why his 327 detonation didn't happen. Jamal is still in the restroom where I left him, probably terrified about what comes next. How do we proceed? David asked. Carefully. Imran is experienced and intelligent. He'll realize that missing his detonation window means operational compromise. His options are to abort and escape, attempt manual detonation, or try to determine what went wrong and salvage the operation. Which is most likely? Mimi considered the psychological profile she'd developed during their brief encounter. He's too invested in this operation to simply abort. The personal and ideological motivations run too deep. He'll try to salvage it, which means he'll look for Jamal to find out what happened. David's phone rang again, and he answered with the clipped efficiency of someone managing multiple crisis protocols. After a brief conversation, he turned back to the group. Bomb disposal has confirmed the second device, larger than the first, positioned exactly as your intelligence indicated. They estimate it would have brought down the entire Level 2 structure. The implications settled over the security checkpoint like a physical weight. Hundreds of passengers were processed through that area every hour. The timing of the second explosion, 10 minutes after the first, would have caught emergency responders and evacuated passengers in the collapse zone. How long to disarm both devices? Fields asked. First device should be clear within 10 minutes. Second device is more complex. Maybe 20 minutes for safe disarmament. Mimi checked her watch. 3:31 p.m. Imran will be getting desperate. 4 minutes past his first detonation window, and he's hearing normal airport operations instead of sirens and chaos. He'll move soon. Move how? He'll try to contact Jamal directly. When that fails because of the jamming, he'll go looking for him physically. That's our opportunity to intercept him before he can implement backup plans. David nodded, understanding. You want to be there when he finds Jamal? I want to be there with sufficient backup to ensure he's taken into custody rather than given the opportunity to detonate devices manually or trigger secondary operations we haven't identified. Fields was already coordinating with terminal security officers, positioning them near the restroom where Jamal waited. But Mimi knew from experience that standard security personnel weren't trained for high-stakes terrorist apprehension. Too much force could trigger exactly the escalation they were trying to prevent. I need to be the primary contact, she told David. Imran doesn't know I exist yet. When he approaches Jamal, I can intercept him using linguistic and cultural advantages he won't expect. That's dangerous. If he's armed, he's more likely to use weapons against uniformed security personnel than against someone he perceives as non-threatening. My appearance and position give me tactical advantages that traditional law enforcement doesn't have in this situation. Farah looked up from her computer terminal. I'm showing movement near the restroom area. Single individual. Matches the description of your primary suspect, approaching from the main concourse. The moment Mimi had been preparing for was arriving. All the intelligence gathering, all the bureaucratic resistance, all the careful coordination was about to culminate in a face-to-face encounter with someone who'd spent months planning to kill innocent people in the name of ideology. David, I need you to coordinate with FBI units when they arrive. Fields, keep your people positioned but not visible. Imran will abort if he sees obvious security presence. Farah, monitor communications and camera feeds. If this goes wrong, you'll need to track his movement and coordinate response. What about backup? David asked. You can't go in there alone. Mimi smiled grimly. I won't be alone. I'll have 15 years of experience dealing with people exactly like Imran, and I'll have the one advantage he won't expect. Someone who understands his language, his culture, and his psychology better than he understands them himself. She walked toward the restroom area with the calm confidence of someone who'd finally found herself back in her element. Behind her, the terminal continued its normal operations, while federal agents worked to disarm devices that could have killed hundreds of people. Ahead of her, a confrontation that would determine whether months of careful planning would end in mass casualties, or the quiet arrest of someone who'd underestimated the ordinary people standing between him and his extraordinary evil. The clock on the terminal wall showed 3:33 p.m. as Mimi positioned herself near the restroom entrance, ready to meet the man who thought he could wage war on innocent travelers without anyone fighting back. Imran Curry moved through the terminal with the controlled urgency of someone whose carefully orchestrated plan was unraveling in real time. His composed exterior masked the growing panic as he processed the implications of the silence where explosions should have shattered the afternoon calm. No sirens, no screaming, no chaos, just the mundane sounds of normal airport operations continuing as if his months of preparation had simply evaporated into irrelevance. He approached the restroom area where he'd last instructed Jamal to wait, his mind cycling through possible explanations for the operational failure. Technical malfunction was possible but unlikely. He'd tested the trigger mechanisms repeatedly, verified the cell phone connections, confirmed the timing sequences. Law enforcement interdiction was more probable, but that would have resulted in visible security activity, evacuations, emergency response protocols. The most disturbing possibility was betrayal. Jamal's psychological profile had always been the operation's weak point. Young, impressionable, recruited through online manipulation rather than genuine ideological commitment. If he'd lost his nerve and approached authorities, the entire network could be compromised. Mimi watched Imran's approach from her position near the newsstand, noting the controlled way he scanned the area for threats while maintaining the appearance of a casual traveler. His training was evident in his movements. Professional operational security, situational awareness that marked him as someone with experience in hostile environments. But his focus was entirely on visible threats, the uniformed security personnel and obvious surveillance points that traditional law enforcement would use. He didn't notice the middle-aged janitor reading a magazine near the restroom entrance. When Imran entered the men's restroom, Mimi waited 30 seconds before following. The facility was empty except for Jamal, who stood at the far sink with the expression of someone who'd accepted his fate, and Imran, who was speaking in rapid, urgent Arabic. "Why haven't you answered your phone? The detonation window passed 4 minutes ago, and I'm hearing nothing from either device location." "The phones aren't working," Jamal replied miserably. "Something's wrong with the cellular service throughout the terminal." "That's not possible. I tested the connections this morning." "It's very possible when federal authorities implement emergency frequency jamming," Mimi interrupted in perfect Arabic, stepping into view with the calm confidence of someone who'd finally found herself exactly where she belonged. Both men spun toward her voice, but their reactions couldn't have been more different. Jamal's face showed relief mixed with terror. Relief that the impossible burden of his secret was finally shared. Terror at what would happen next. Imran's expression shifted from surprise to calculation to barely controlled rage as he processed the implications of her presence and her words. "Who are you?" Imran demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his jacket pocket. "I'm someone who understands the language you thought no one else would recognize. Someone who's been tracking your operation since you and Jamal discussed cleansing and gifts 2 hours ago." Mimi kept her voice steady, drawing on years of experience managing high-stress interrogations. "Someone who prevented the deaths of 200 innocent people because a janitor was in the right place at the right time." Imran's eyes narrowed as he assessed this unexpected development. "You're law enforcement. I'm a woman who cleans restrooms and mops floors. I'm also someone who spent 15 years preventing people like you from killing people like them." She gestured toward the terminal beyond the restroom walls. "The devices have been located and secured. The FBI is coordinating your apprehension. Your operation is over. You think you understand what this is about?" Imran's voice carried the cold certainty of someone whose worldview had been crystallized by loss and rage. "You think this is just terrorism that can be stopped with proper security procedures. I think this is grief that's been weaponized by people who profit from other people's pain," Mimi replied calmly. "I think you've been convinced that killing strangers will somehow balance the scales for losses that can never be balanced. My family died in a drone strike outside Damascus. 12 people, including my 8-year-old daughter, killed because someone in Washington decided their lives were acceptable collateral damage in the war on terror." Imran's composure cracked slightly, revealing the raw pain beneath his operational facade. "They called it a precision strike against terrorist infrastructure. The infrastructure was my brother's wedding celebration." Mimi felt the familiar weight of recognizing genuine suffering beneath inexcusable actions. She'd encountered it countless times during her military service, people whose legitimate grievances had been twisted into justifications for unconscionable violence. "I'm sorry for your loss," No parent should have to bury their child because of decisions made by people who never see the consequences of their choices. Your sympathy doesn't resurrect the dead. Neither does killing other people's children. Your daughter wouldn't want her death used to justify murdering families like yours. She'd want you to find ways to honor her memory that create life instead of destroying it. Imran pulled a cell phone from his pocket, not the one connected to the devices, but a different model that Mimi recognized as a backup trigger mechanism. The operation continues until justice is served. I have manual override capabilities for both devices. The devices have been disarmed by federal bomb disposal units. Your override capabilities are connected to circuits that no longer exist. Mimi stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. It's over, Imran. The question now is whether you surrender peacefully or force a confrontation that will only add to the suffering you're trying to avenge. For a moment, she saw uncertainty flicker across his features, the psychological struggle between commitment to his plan and recognition that the plan had failed. But ideology and grief had hardened into something that couldn't be easily dissolved by logic or compassion. You don't know who I am, he said, raising the phone toward the manual trigger sequence. You don't know what I'm capable of. Mimi looked directly into his eyes and spoke 5 words in the Latakia dialect she'd learned during operations along the Syrian coast. I knew your father's voice. Quote, Imran froze completely, the phone trembling in his hand as recognition and terror flashed across his face. The words carried implications that shattered his operational security and exposed connections to conflicts he thought were buried in classified files and forgotten battlefields. That's impossible, he whispered. Colonel Ahmad Khouri, Syrian Republican Guard, captured during the siege of Qusair in 2013. I was the interpreter during his interrogation by U.S. intelligence forces. He spoke about his son studying engineering in Damascus, about his daughter-in-law who was pregnant with his first grandchild. Mimi's voice carried the weight of memories that connected their current confrontation to tragedy that preceded it by years. He died in detention 3 months later. Officially, it was cardiac arrest. Unofficially, it was the result of enhanced interrogation techniques that went too far. The phone slipped from Imran's nerveless fingers, clattering on the restroom floor as the psychological foundations of his worldview shifted beneath him. His father's death had been the original trauma that set him on the path toward radicalization, the injustice that made subsequent losses feel like part of a deliberate pattern of persecution. You were there, he said, his voice hollow with the recognition that his enemy wasn't an abstract institution but someone who'd witnessed his family's destruction firsthand. I was there. I tried to stop what was happening to your father, but I was a junior enlisted specialist with no authority to intervene in decisions made by senior officers. I've carried the guilt of that failure for 10 years, just like you've carried the rage of his death. Sirens could be heard in the distance now, FBI units arriving to coordinate the final phase of the operation. But in the restroom, the confrontation had shifted from tactical to personal, from law enforcement procedure to human recognition of shared trauma and mutual responsibility. Your father was a good man caught in an evil war, Mimi continued. He talked about you every day during his detention, about his hope that you would find ways to build something better than the world that had destroyed his generation. This isn't what he would have wanted for you. Imran sank against the wall, his operational persona finally collapsing under the weight of memories he'd tried to transform into weapons. I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to live with what they took from me. Quote, you stop by choosing to honor the dead through actions that create rather than destroy. You live by accepting that justice and vengeance aren't the same thing, and that healing requires building bridges instead of burning them. The restroom door opened as David Kim entered with 2 FBI agents, their weapons drawn but not aimed, ready to respond to whatever they encountered. They found Imran sitting on the floor with his hands in clear view, Jamal standing near the sinks with tears streaming down his face, and Mimi positioned between them with the calm authority of someone who'd just prevented a tragedy through words rather than weapons. Miss Haddad, David said quietly, are you all right? I'm fine. Mr. Khouri is ready to surrender peacefully. Mr. Saadi is prepared to cooperate fully with authorities as a material witness. She looked at the FBI agents with the expression of someone transferring responsibility to people trained for the next phase of the operation. The immediate threat has been neutralized. The Federal Building conference room felt sterile and impersonal after the chaos of the terminal, its beige walls and fluorescent lighting creating an environment designed for bureaucratic efficiency rather than human connection. Mimi sat at a long table across from Agent Sarah Chen, the FBI's lead counterterrorism coordinator for the Southeast region, while David Kim and Officer Fields flanked her with the uncomfortable solidarity of people who'd shared an extraordinary experience. "Ms. Haddad," Agent Chen began, reviewing a file thick with documentation, "your actions today prevented what our analysts are calling one of the most sophisticated domestic terrorism operations we've encountered in the past 5 years. The devices were professionally constructed, the timing was calculated to maximize casualties and emergency response complications, and the operational security was nearly flawless." "Nearly," Mimi replied quietly. "Nearly. The failure was human rather than technical. Specifically, the psychological instability of the younger conspirator and your ability to exploit that vulnerability through cultural and linguistic advantages that traditional law enforcement wouldn't have possessed." Agent Chen closed the file and leaned forward with the expression of someone about to make an offer she expected would be well received. "The Bureau would like to discuss the possibility of bringing you back into federal service. Your expertise in Middle Eastern languages and cultural dynamics, combined with your field experience and demonstrated operational capabilities, would be invaluable for counterterrorism operations." The offer hung in the air like a question Mimi had been asking herself for years, whether the skills and knowledge she'd accumulated during her military service could find meaningful application in her civilian life. For a decade, she'd mourned the loss of purpose that came with leaving behind work that felt essential, the sense that her contributions mattered in ways that went beyond personal satisfaction. "What would that involve?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was gathering information rather than expressing interest. "Liaison work with local law enforcement agencies, threat assessment for situations involving Arabic-speaking suspects, cultural interpretation for ongoing investigations. Essentially the same work you did today, but with federal authority and institutional support." David shifted in his chair. "Agent Chen, I think you should know that Ms. Haddad has been working as a janitor not because she lacks better options, but because she chose anonymity over recognition after her military service. The question isn't whether she's qualified for federal work. The question is whether federal work is qualified for her." Officer Fields, who had remained silent through most of the debriefing, finally spoke. "I owe you an apology, Ms. Haddad, not just for today, but for every day I've treated you like your opinions didn't matter because of your job title. I let my assumptions about people's backgrounds cloud my judgment, and that could have cost lives." Mimi appreciated his honesty, but her focus remained on Agent Chen's offer. "I'm grateful for the Bureau's confidence, but I need to ask whether this position would require me to work within the same institutional frameworks that led to my warnings being dismissed today. If federal agencies are still structured to prioritize credentials over expertise, then adding my name to an organizational chart won't solve the fundamental problems." "What do you mean?" "I mean that the most dangerous threats often come from sources that don't fit traditional intelligence profiles. The people planning attacks aren't necessarily the ones with obvious criminal backgrounds or established terrorist connections. They're often ordinary people who've been radicalized by grief or manipulated by others who understand how to weaponize psychological vulnerability." Mimi gestured toward the terminal visible through the conference room window. Today's operation was nearly successful because 2 men had a conversation in a public restroom, confident that no one around them would understand their language or recognize the significance of their planning. Traditional surveillance wouldn't have caught it. Electronic monitoring wouldn't have flagged it. Only human intelligence, someone with the right background in the right place at the right time, prevented a catastrophe. "Which is exactly why we need people like you in positions where your expertise can be utilized effectively," Agent Chen replied. "People like me are already in those positions. They're working as janitors and food service employees and maintenance staff. Invisible people with valuable backgrounds who've been dismissed by institutions that value titles more than talents." Mimi's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd thought deeply about these issues. "The question isn't whether I should rejoin federal service. The question is whether federal service is ready to listen to people who don't fit traditional profiles." Agent Chen made notes as Mimi spoke, clearly recognizing the validity of her observations, even if they challenged conventional recruiting and organizational strategies. "What would you recommend?" "Develop relationships with the people who are already embedded in the environments where threats develop." Stop assuming that expertise comes only from people with advanced degrees and security clearances. Start recognizing that the most valuable intelligence often comes from sources that wouldn't pass traditional background checks, but have insights that can't be replicated through formal training. The conference room fell quiet as the implications of her suggestions settled over the group. Traditional law enforcement and intelligence agencies were built on hierarchical structures that prioritized credentialed expertise over experiential knowledge, formal education over practical skills developed through non-traditional paths. I appreciate the offer, Mimi continued, but I think I can be more effective continuing to work where I am, building relationships with the Farahs and Martinezes who are willing to listen when someone notices something that doesn't fit normal patterns. Change happens from the ground up, not from federal directives that filter down through bureaucratic channels. David smiled with the recognition of someone who'd known her long enough to predict her decision. You're choosing legacy over recognition. I'm choosing impact over authority. Today worked because people were willing to act on imperfect information from an imperfect source. That's not something you can institutionalize. It's something you have to cultivate through relationships and trust that develop over time. Agent Chen closed her notes and extended her hand. Miss Haddad, if you change your mind, the Bureau's offer remains open. But I understand your position and I respect your decision. What you did today will be studied and incorporated into our training protocols for recognizing unconventional intelligence sources. As they shook hands, Mimi felt the satisfaction of someone who'd found a way to contribute without compromising the principles that had guided her through military service and civilian life. She'd prevented a terrorist attack not by returning to federal service, but by remaining true to the values that had originally drawn her to serve others. Outside the conference room, the terminal was returning to normal operations. Passengers moved through security checkpoints unaware of how close they'd come to tragedy, their safety preserved by people whose contributions would never be acknowledged in news reports or official commendations. That anonymity, Mimi realized, was exactly what made their work possible. 1 week later, Mimi's alarm clock rang at 5:30 a.m. with the same mechanical persistence it had maintained for 3 years. She rose from bed with the practiced efficiency of someone whose routine had been temporarily disrupted but fundamentally unchanged, showered, dressed in her gray uniform, and prepared for another day of work that most people would never notice. The drive to the airport carried her through familiar neighborhoods, awakening to another ordinary Thursday. Coffee shops opened their doors to the early commuters, joggers traced their regular routes through suburban streets, and the city emerged from sleep with the gradual rhythm of a place where extraordinary events were quickly absorbed into the flow of normal life. She parked in the employee lot and walked toward the staff entrance, nodding to coworkers whose acknowledgement carried subtle differences from the previous week. Word had spread through the airport's informal networks, not the classified details of the federal investigation, but the general understanding that something significant had happened and that Mimi had been involved in ways that challenged assumptions about whose contributions mattered. At the supply closet, she gathered her cart and checked inventory with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her approach to everything from convoy security to threat assessment. But as she prepared to begin her rounds, she noticed a young man in a janitor's uniform, watching her with curious interest. "You're Mimi, right?" he asked, approaching with the tentative respect of someone meeting a person whose reputation preceded them. "I'm Carlos. Just started this week. The supervisor said I should ask you about proper procedures and protocols." Mimi smiled at the innocent request, remembering her own first days when the complexity of airport operations had seemed overwhelming. "What would you like to know?" "Well, everyone says you really know this place, like you notice things other people miss. I was wondering if you could teach me what to look for." The question carried implications beyond janitorial training, suggesting that her colleagues understood her expertise extended beyond floor cleaning and restroom maintenance. But rather than elaborate on her background or recent experiences, she simply nodded. The most important thing is to pay attention. People assume that service workers don't see anything significant, but we're often the only ones who observe how spaces are actually used, rather than how they're supposed to be used. That difference can be very revealing. As they walked through the terminal, Mimi found herself unconsciously conducting training that drew on 15 years of intelligence work disguised as orientation for a new employee. She pointed out sight lines and crowd patterns, discussed behavioral indicators that suggested stress or discomfort, and explained how routine maintenance provided opportunities for systematic observation that was invisible to casual oversight. You make it sound like detective work, Carlos observed. Good maintenance is detective work. You have to understand how systems function, identify problems before they become crises, and notice changes that indicate developing issues. Whether you're diagnosing mechanical problems or assessing human behavior, the principles are the same. Quote, near Gate C7, they encountered Farah conducting a routine security checkpoint inspection. She approached them with the confident bearing of someone whose recent experiences had fundamentally changed her relationship with authority and institutional hierarchy. Mimi, I wanted to give you this, she said, handing over a small envelope. It's from the Director of Homeland Security. They're naming the new protocol after you. The Haddad Protocol, for recognizing and responding to unconventional intelligence sources. Mimi accepted the envelope without opening it, understanding that its contents represented recognition she neither sought nor needed. Thank you, but I hope they understand that protocols are only as effective as the people implementing them. The real work happens when individuals choose to listen to information that doesn't arrive through official channels. They understand. That's why the protocol emphasizes relationship building and trust rather than hierarchical reporting structures. It's designed to encourage the kind of collaboration that happened last week. Carlos listened to this exchange with growing awareness that his new colleague represented something more significant than efficient floor mopping. But Mimi deflected his curiosity by redirecting attention to practical concerns. Carlos, would you mind checking the restroom supplies near Gate B47? I want to make sure everything is properly stocked for the afternoon rush. As he walked away, Farah lowered her voice. How are you handling everything? The media attention, the federal offers, the way people look at you differently now? People have always looked at me, Mimi replied. The difference is that now some of them see me as well. That's progress. But it's not the kind of change that happens through individual recognition. It happens when institutions create space for voices that have always existed but haven't always been heard. A few yards away, Officer Fields approached with the careful demeanor of someone who was still processing how fundamentally his assumptions had been challenged. Miss Haddad, I wanted to let you know that we're implementing new training protocols based on what happened last week. All security personnel will receive instruction on recognizing and appropriately responding to intelligence from unconventional sources. That's encouraging. But remember that the most important training isn't procedural. It's psychological. People have to overcome their assumptions about whose opinions matter before they can properly evaluate the information those opinions contain. Fields nodded with the chastened understanding of someone who'd learned an important lesson through near-catastrophic experience. Would you be willing to help develop that training? Your insights about institutional bias and threat recognition would be invaluable. I'd be happy to consult on the development, but the training itself should be conducted by people within your organizational structure. Change that comes from external experts tends to be temporary. Change that develops from internal reflection tends to be permanent. As Fields walked away, Mimi returned to her routine with the satisfaction of someone who'd found ways to contribute without abandoning the principles that had guided her choices. Around her, the terminal hummed with the controlled chaos of thousands of travelers pursuing their individual journeys, protected by security measures they would never see and people they would never know. Near the vending machines, she noticed a small girl struggling to reach the buttons for her selection. Mimi approached quietly and helped her retrieve a package of crackers, accepting the child's grateful smile as payment for a small kindness that required no special training or federal authorization. "Thank you," the girl said. "You're welcome," Mimi replied, watching as the child rejoined her family and disappeared into the crowd. At the end of her shift, Mimi cleaned her cart and returned supplies to the storage closet with the same methodical care she brought to everything. Tomorrow would bring another day of work that most people wouldn't notice, performed by someone whose contributions extended far beyond the tasks listed in her job description. As she walked toward the employee exit, she passed a small plaque that hadn't been there the previous week, in honor of those who act when no one believes. No names, no specific references to recent events, just a quiet acknowledgement that heroism often came from sources that defied conventional expectations. Mimi smiled and continued walking, carrying with her the knowledge that true security came not from elaborate systems or sophisticated technology, but from ordinary people who chose to pay attention, to speak up, and to act when action was required. Just Mimi, walking through an airport where 200 people continued their journeys because someone had been listening when it mattered most. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.